Good evening. I'm going to do my best to keep this a little shorter, a little less planned out. If you hear laughter and giggles in the background, it's because my two daughters convinced me that it's okay to get chickens after much labor. They convinced me it's okay to get chickens for the yard, and that they would take full care of them, and they would feed and watch over and chase down and bury when they die and so on. So I gave in, and right now they're all goo goo gaga-ing over the little chicks that are downstairs in the cardboard box. So bear with me. But what I wanted to talk about tonight is having to do with playing the blame game. I think it's something we have to watch for as Christians, as a church, as a community of people, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. The beauty of this current dilemma in crisis in our culture is that it kind of started with pretty much no one to blame, I believe. Pestilence is one of those things that you really have a difficult time trying to say, oh, it's his fault or it's her fault. And so even if we become victims of a plague or victims of an economy that has become completely disrupted by men's decisions in regard to how we cope with this plague, it's hard to really feel like you can push the blame on someone. Even though you feel like a victim, it's hard to come up with a villain. But we will try to come up with villains. And this is part of what I wanted to talk about this evening. Having a carnal, earthy approach where we're always feeling like the victims, always looking for villains to blame for our plights in life is not uncommon to us in many parts of our lives, in our normal lives. We tend to, when things go bad for us, we often want to blame somebody for it. Blame our wife for it, blame our kids for it, blame our mom and dad or the church elders or the governor or your boss or your employer or your congregant. It's not a faith-filled way of living and thinking. It's definitely a very basy and kind of a sinful grudge-holding way to live, and it's a pathetic way to approach life. Job is a good example of someone who had a faith-filled, heavenly perspective on who he was as a man and who he was meant to be in the earth. And Job had gone through an awful lot. Talk about blame. I'm going to find that really quickly if I can. I forgot to open up the page to it. But he suffered greatly at the hands of something God allowed and permitted to take place through Satan. But there were at least two different situations that Job suffered from that had to do with other people causing him harm. And one was in Job 1, chapter 14, that there came a messenger to Job, and he said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And then he alone was the sole survivor. Later on in that same narration, it says, the Chaldeans formed three groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And that person was, again, the one who brought the report to Job. So Job suffered from other people. He was a victim at the hands of villains. And yet his response in all of this was Godward. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And so he saw all things from the perspective of God still was caring for him. God was still involved in his life. There is a place for blame and accountability. There are villains, and we can be victims to those villains. But just always recall and remember who sits on the throne of heaven, and understand even that villains are under the control of the Lord. Sometimes we can get goofy, though, as we want to place blame on other people when it's not even their fault. And that's when we so dislike and are frustrated by our circumstances, that we're just looking anywhere, almost in a frenzy, to be able to blame somebody. Not so frenzy-ish, but an example of passing the buck is Adam blaming Eve for his sin. Adam was responsible for sin. It was the man. He fell, and he didn't like the circumstances of the confrontation. He stands before God now, a fallen and sinful man, and he tries to blame the woman. The woman did the same thing. She had made the choice, even though the serpent tempted her. It was her choice, and she really had no one to blame but herself, and yet she tried to push it off onto the serpent. My problems are caused because of the serpent. Yet we do this all the time. You know, how often do husbands blame wives when things aren't going well, and they have gone astray, and yet they look on the bed pillow next to them or in the kitchen and go, there it is. It's your fault, right? As I said, there were legitimate times for blame to be placed. There is sometimes people who are at fault and responsible for the bad things that are happening to you, and you should bring that to their attention in whatever form or fashion. Sometimes it may be a lawsuit. Sometimes it may be just a confrontation. Sometimes it may be bringing the authorities into play, the church authorities or the civil magistrate or whatever. But our attitude should still be that of Job, okay? Even though these things are needing to be dealt with, yet God is still in control, and even if he's allowed these things to happen to me, yet will I hope in him. I think Joseph is a prime example of somebody who had the right perspective, a godly and heavenly perspective when it came to being a victim and having villains work against him. He had 10 brothers who sold him into slavery to the Ishmaelite traders in Genesis 37. And they went off and told their dad, oh, he was dead, Joseph's dead, we think. We just found his coat of many colors, it's got blood on it, and we think wild beasts have killed him. But Joseph was off, and as a victim, taken to Egypt, eventually thrown into jail there, and he worked his way up. I don't remember all the different circumstances, but he did well as administrator in the jail. They rose him up. At some point along the way, he became involved in Potiphar's household. His wife falsely accused him of sexual aggression, and he fled from her, but was in trouble again, and eventually found his way up to the Pharaoh, because Joseph was an interpreter of dreams, and Pharaoh had some dreams he was concerned about. Anyway, he became second in command, and this is a really pretty cool part of the story, because he was in such a high position, and all throughout the land there was great famine, even up into Canaan, where his brothers and family lived, and so they had to come to Egypt because Egypt had food thanks to Joseph and Joseph's God. So when his brothers arrived, even though he could be holding a grudge, even though he was a victim to those villains, Joseph said to his brothers, come near me, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And so he did confront them with their fault. But then he goes on and says, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So, verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. So he starts off by saying, whom you sold into Egypt, talking to his brothers, but then he ends by saying, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. almost as if he's trying to lift the burden from off of their shoulders. And yet they were guilty of wrongdoing. He still saw things from a more heavenly perspective. And so I get a little concerned sometimes in our day here that we get a little too blame oriented. We don't like being kept from one another. We're kind of locked in our homes. The economy is just taken a real bad turn, and people have lost jobs. People will continue to lose jobs, doubtless, and spending and buying and things is going to be very tight, I think, for months to come. I could be wrong, but I'm concerned that we're looking for a neck to wring, that we feel like victims, and we're looking for who are the villains here that we can blame. And this took place even back in France and in Europe altogether during the Black Death, a plague that swept through Europe where millions and millions died. And in France in 1349, 1350, those 2 years in particular, the French people were starting to try to figure out what's going on here. They had no clue what was killing people. It was certainly a pestilence. And they decided that there were some people that weren't getting as sick as others. And they believed, indeed, that those people were the Jews that lived in the land. And the Jews, who did not drink out of the same wells in a lot of situations as the Christian French, they began to accuse the Jews of poisoning the wells. And they were trying to make the argument, I don't know where it started, but that the Jews had poisoned the wells, and that's why people were dying. And so Jews became persecuted at that time and killed and massacred in great numbers because of this blame game, looking for a neck to wring. And I think we got to be very careful at this point in our own history here in America and throughout the world, of course. But I get a little concerned because we're looking for necks to wring when things don't go well for us. And that can be a scary place. I do believe right now in our government. I do believe in our churches, for that matter, that people are trying to do what's right. I think they're trying to respond in a healthy manner. I think they're trying to respond in a way that is for people, not against people. Although that can change, and that can go wrong, and I'm sure not everyone has the greatest of motives either. There might be some villains, and there's certainly many, many victims. But no matter what others do, this is what I want to say in the end. Whatever happens to us, what others do to us, no matter how men might conspire against us, we still belong to God. And Christ is still reigning from the right hand of the Father. He must permit it for it to be, all right? Doesn't mean we don't confront it. It doesn't mean we don't oppose it in some cases, but just don't let it shape your life. Don't let it be the thing that dictates to you how you live, how upright you are. I encourage you to see history more through the eyes of a Job, more through the perspective of a Joseph. God is working things out on behalf of his church. Let us pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. So I'm quite certain we will be live streaming church again, so people will stay in their homes, and you can watch it on the YouTube channel that we set up. I also believe you'll see a new prayer list. I know that I have got a couple of prayer requests to add to the people I called this week, and I expect that the deacons and elders will be calling you if you're a member of the church. So please share with them, give them updates on previous requests if you could as well. That would be great. Thanks.